Hi, the Launchpad Pro MK3 and the Launchpad X are the newest iterations of the large and medium-sized grid-based MIDI controllers from Mutation. They don't make any sounds on their own, but rather they're designed to play and control other software or hardware instruments and are also deeply integrated with Ableton Live. These two are the big brothers to Launchpad Mini MK3. I already compared the Launchpad X to the Mini. I'll link to that video below. In this video, I'll look at what sets these two apart. Let's get started. Originally, Launchpads were designed mainly as controllers for Ableton Live. However, with the recent MK3 updates, both have become fully customizable MIDI controllers capable of sending both note and CC information, and the Launchpad Pro MK3 also now contains a built-in 4-track sequencer. Before we dive into the details, let's take a look at the biggest differences between the two. First, in terms of price, as of the making of this video, Launchpad Pro MK3 costs around $350 and Launchpad X costs around $200. Then in terms of size, the pads on both seem to be exactly the same size. The overall size of Pro is a bit bigger overall to accommodate the 2 extra rows on the bottom and a column of buttons on the left. But it's not that much bigger, I think, and side by side both are exactly the same height. Following my non-scientific test of the pads on both, it seems like the pads on Pro MK3 are slightly more sensitive to soft touch, though both are velocity sensitive. No, frankly, I didn't notice any lack of sensitivity on Launchpad X, it's just that the Pro MK3 seems to be more sensitive to very light touch. Both devices are also pressure sensitive with polyphonic aftertouch if your software or hardware synth supports it. True to their legacy, both serve well as session view controllers for Ableton Live, though the extra column and rows on 3 obviously come in handy. More on that within the context of Ableton Live in a bit. When used to control either software or hardware instruments, both have a note and custom modes that you can customize with different layouts based on the instrument you want to control or what you want to control, whether it's MIDI CCs or program changes and notes. But critically for controlling hardware instruments, Pro MK3 has 2 TRS MIDI outputs, and it comes with 3 dongles, 2 for the outputs and 1 for the input, alongside USB-C, which both have. So you could still use Launchpad X to control a hardware instrument, but that instrument would either need to have a USB-A host jack to connect it to, or you could also use a USB MIDI host. Aside from the note and custom modes, MK3 also has a chord mode, more on this interesting layout later on. And of course, a major feature that MK3 has that X doesn't is the built-in sequencer. We will, of course, go over this in detail later on. Generally speaking, it's a 4-track sequencer with each track capable of chaining up to 8 patterns of 32 steps each. You can create scenes where different patterns run and chain those scenes. And then these 4 tracks and patterns live in projects. You can have up to 64 projects simultaneously on a Launchpad Pro, and you can move projects back and forth into your computer. Another minor difference between the two, if you short press a mode or a view on the Launchpad Pro, it'll move into that mode. However, if you long press it, you can move into it temporarily, use it, and then release it to go back. It doesn't work that way here. Here, a long press will get you into an additional function or settings page. So that's the overview. Let's start digging into these topics and comparing the two in detail. Let's start with Ableton Live's Session View Control. Both give you an 8x8 view into Ableton Live's grid for launching clips and recording into clip slots. So I could launch a clip from either one, launch scenes from either one by pressing the scene button. And then I can stop clips by hitting empty pads on either one. You can navigate around the grid in single step increments on both, up and down and left and right. But MK3 lets you jump around in groups of 8 clips. If you hold the session view, you get a mini view into your entire grid, and you can jump around quickly from zone to zone. Both Launchpads have mixer controls, but Launchpad X uses these functions in sort of like a shift mode. When you press the mixer button, they no longer launch tracks, but rather have different functions based on what's written here on the bottom. Whereas Launchpad Pro's mixer functionality is directly accessible here. So for example, if I wanted to control the volume of tracks, I'd press here. Once you get into this mode, they both function identically. A soft press will move the parameters slowly. A hard press will move them immediately. And you can also press a button multiple times to fine-tune what you want the parameter to be. Same goes for pans. You see 8 tracks at a time. With sends, there's more functionality on Pro Mark III. You only have 2 sends with the Launchpad X, and if you press sends, you get access to up to 8 sends over here. Stop, clip, mute, solo, and record arm work on both, but on Launchpad X, you have to sacrifice a row of pads for this. So let's say that I launch this row and want to say stop a few clips. I use this bottom row to do that. Whereas with Pro Mark III, I'd use this row of track buttons to accomplish the same task. So for example, if I wanted to stop clips, I'd use these buttons. Launchpad Pro Mark III lets you select tracks by pressing the track select keys. Those keys don't exist and there's no track select on Launchpad X, but you could sort of work around it by pressing on clips that have stops in them or empty clips and select tracks this way. Both also give you access to Ableton Live's capture MIDI function. Here it's with a long press and here it's with a shift press. So those are more or less the similarities as far as Ableton Live is controlled, but Pro Mark III has a lot of additional Ableton Live functionality. If you hold shift, these buttons function as undo, redo, metronome or click, and tap tempo. Another thing that Pro can do and X can't is control device parameters. So let's say that I select this track. You can see the wavetable device in here. If I hit the device button, I can go ahead and edit the device parameters. I can use the left and right arrows to move between devices in my track. And if a device has more than 8 parameters, these pads will light up and you can move between pages of device parameters. Now, obviously, there's a limit to how useful this is because you can't really tell which parameter you're changing unless you remember it by heart. So you can use this, right? I can change multiple parameters and maybe gradually learn what does what. Another option is to use a macro or group. So if I move into the macro group here, I could assign specific parameters and then have direct control of the most important parameters in my device in one grid. Now, while Launchpad X doesn't have a device control mode like Pro Mark III, you can create custom templates with faders. I'll show you how in a bit. So you can, with MIDI mapping, control macros or even devices using Launchpad X. There's additional functionality in this column here on the left. Transport, of course, is always welcome, which Launchpad X doesn't have, though you could potentially map custom controls to transport or anything else in Ableton Live. And then when you're in session view, there are a few more options. You can clear pads if you like. I certainly don't want to do that, so I can undo that. Duplicate, shift duplicate, which is clip double, and quantize work the same way as clear. You hold the button, then choose what you want to quantize, duplicate, or double. Then shift record quantize will activate or deactivate record quantization. And then finally, when recording notes live into a clip, you can either choose to record for as long as you want and stop when you want, or record using a fixed length. You activate fixed length by pressing fixed length. And if you want to determine how many bars a fixed length recording will take, you hold fixed length, then choose anywhere from 1 to 8 fixed length bars. Another little perk of Pro Mark III, you can't select pads without activating them on Launchpad X. You can, however, do that using Shift and just pressing the pad and selecting it, which won't activate it. So that's it as far as the differences between the two as far as Ableton Live is concerned. Let's move on to Note Mode. One nice little feature in Note Mode that is relevant for Ableton Live and applies to both. If you move into note mode and control a drum track, you'll see a drum grid. If you move into a melodic track, you'll see the melodic controls. Anyway, by default for melodic tracks, this gives you a chromatic grid-based layout of notes, meaning that the pads on each row are a semitone apart. And each row is 5 semitones or a fourth above the row below it. On both, you can transpose this grid up and down or left and right. Both will let you configure note mode, here with a long press on note and here with shift note. Both let you determine the intervals between the rows, the scale that you want to use, the root note works identically, as well as the MIDI channel you want to broadcast on. again, same exact thing. Both will also let you toggle between a chromatic layout and a scale layout. So in a chromatic layout, these represent the white keys as long as you're in a major scale, and these represent the black keys. But if you want to eliminate the black keys or the out of scale keys, depending on the scale you're at, let's say a major scale, then now all the pads become notes in whatever scale you determined. That was a major scale. Let's go, for example, to a minor scale. So they're pretty much identical in note mode, except of course that Launchpad X will only send MIDI data out the USB-C port, whereas Launchpad Pro MK3 will send out data through its MIDI outs as well. So you can, but don't have to use this with a computer for note mode, as well as, of course, chord and custom modes, which we will get to now. So both Launchpad Pro MK3 and Launchpad X support custom layouts. Custom layouts, like I mentioned before, let you configure the grid with widgets any way that you like. So this is a pad grid layout, and you could also have a piano keyboard style layout with 4 octaves here. And then layouts can also have faders for CC controls, and these can be bipolar or unipolar. Pads work here as well, of course, as well as keyboard layouts. You can send program changes if you like. So let's take a look at how to create a custom layout. I've got a few programmed in here, but number 7 is empty. You need to enter Novation's components site or download their software, hit Launchpad Pro, and let's create a custom mode. So the idea here is pretty simple. You've got a bunch of widgets here on the right, and you just drag and drop a widget onto wherever you want it to be on the grid. So let's put that over here. You can customize its colors if you like, to anything you like. This is a single octave. You could set which octave this controls and which MIDI channel this will send information on. Let's maybe add another scale widget here as well. When you add a scale widget, you can not only change its colors, but also determine which scale it'll be. So let's go for Mixolydian, why not? And then there are a few other widgets. You've got horizontal faders, which I can add, let's say, a couple into here. Let's change this guy's color too. You can determine which CC these faders control, and of course, which MIDI channel they'll send information on. And let's just take a look at the widgets. There's a drum grid widget. I can't fit that here anymore because there's no room for it. There are vertical sliders. Again, can't fit that for now, but you've got them if you need them. And there are single MIDI notes, if you like, to control specific elements of the user interface or just send specific notes, as well as program change and specific CC. Again, each of these can have their own color and their own values. CC buttons can be either momentary, toggle, or trigger. You set their values on or off, and MIDI channel and single MIDI notes as well. And then let's just, to make this complete, look at a program change widget. This doesn't have MSB and LSB, but you can send a program change and channel. Once you're done your layout, or even in between, sending it to Launchpad is super easy. You choose the custom mode you want this to populate, and it's copied into here. Now, up until now, everything you saw is identical for Pro MK3 and for Launchpad X, except that you can store 4 custom modes here and 8 custom modes here. But there is one thing that Pro MK3 has that X doesn't, and that's the ability to set a MIDI channel through the controller itself. So by default, you saw me assign a MIDI channel to each of these widgets, but if I choose master channel, again, this is only available on Launchpad Pro MK3. Let's send that over. So now I could set the master channel here without touching the computer, and I do that by holding Shift and Custom. Then I choose the channel I want to broadcast in, so I know that channel 2 is my piano, and then channel 3 is my Rhodes electric piano. So that's one convenience that Pro MK3 has that X doesn't. Another thing that would be nice and neither has is the ability to transpose these octaves directly from the Launchpad. These buttons don't do anything, so it would be nice if you could transpose these keyboard controllers either by using these or maybe these buttons here. So my little feature request for this. All right, let's move on to chord mode, which, like I mentioned, only exists in Launchpad Pro MK3. So chord mode looks a little bit confusing and non-traditional at first, but it actually makes a lot of sense and is pretty useful. Let's take a look at it. The first 5 columns are the note area. These are just ascending notes in the scale that you determine across the Launchpad. So that was a minor scale. Let's go for a major scale, for example, and go back into chord mode. So just notes going up at different intervals, and you can see the overlaps when I press a pad that lights up the same notes across different rows. Now they're arranged in a way that makes sense, or at intervals that make sense. This is a fifth apart, this is a third, but an octave above. This is the seventh in the original octave, and this is a fifth in the octave above, which makes for creating chords. So this is a major chord, C major in this case, major seventh, and an extended with a higher fifth. The colors somewhat relate to the type of chord, so major chords, minor chords, but this is the root. This is diminished, this green color, which can sometimes be all over the place if you choose different scales. Anyway, that's the note area organized in conveniently musical intervals, but it wouldn't be chord mode without the chord pads, which are these three columns, the orange column being triads in the scale, but inverted when it's time to keep them in the same octave. Okay, so they don't spread out too much. And then you can create your own custom chords in these pads. So let me just clear these out. If I want to create custom chords, I need to be in record mode, which is this guy here. And then hold the pad and then punch in the chord. And this will play that chord. Let's go for this guy. And if I turn off record mode, then I can play the chords and play on top of them. So you can program up to 14 different chords on 2 columns. This functions as record on off. We talked about this. And then this is a sustain button. So if I play like this, it won't sustain, but if I hold sustain, it will sustain the chord. So that's pretty much it for chord mode. You can also transpose the octaves up and down. And when you transpose this, it doesn't impact the chords that you already programmed in. So that's chord mode. Let's move on to talk about the sequencer, which is obviously a big differentiator between the two because Pro Mark III has it and Launchpad X doesn't. Now to keep things simple, I'll be sequencing software instruments, but you can just as easily sequence hardware instruments like I mentioned earlier using the 2 MIDI outs or a hardware instrument connected to a USB MIDI host, for example. Overall, you've got 64 projects on board. You can see these are projects that have data in them and the rest are empty. Let's just pick an empty one and start a sequence. The sequencer is a 4-track sequencer. You choose the track you want to edit using these 4 buttons here. You've got 3 track types, a drum track type, which is organized in a grid, and then either a melodic track that's based on scales or a melodic track that is chromatic. You edit the track types by hitting Shift Sequencer, and then let's say I want track 4 to be a chromatic track. I would press here. You see a preview of the type of track when you select it. So chromatic, scale, and drum. Let's make track 4 a drum track. Now it won't do anything unless I choose the channel that's connected to something. So again, let's go into sequencer settings and I want to choose for track 4, MIDI track 1 through 16. Let's choose track 10 and this is my drum track. Again, this can be an external instrument. Here I've set Ableton Live to listen in to track 10 for my drum kit. Now you can either play live or step sequence. You can step sequence either by pressing the drum you want to sequence and choosing where you want it to play. This is a 32 step sequence by default, but you can make it shorter. Let's maybe choose to play here and here. Maybe add this here. And if I wanted to say add hi-hats, of course, I could do that as well on top of that. Okay. Now it works both ways. So this is where my kicks are and this is where my hi-hats are, or I can press a step and see which drums or which pads are lit up in that step. So that's step sequencing. I could also play live into a track if I hit record. So that's how you sequence drum tracks, and sequencing melodic tracks is the same thing basically. Let's say choose track 3 and go into here. I want to control my piano, which is on MIDI channel 2 with track 3. And I can have it in chromatic mode, but I'm fine with scale mode. So again, either choose a note and pick where it appears, or choose a step and choose which notes appear on that step. And if I wanted to change the scale, I could move, say, from minor to major. So that's how you step sequence notes or chords. I can make a note as long as I want by changing its gate. Let's do that here. So now the chords ring out. If I wanted to save this project, by the way, I could just hit save and then save again. I could also save it to a different location if I wanted. Just hit shift save and then drop it into here. So now I've got 2 copies and I can make changes on this one and keep the original one. So let's indeed go into this guy and keep making changes. You've got access to a few step parameters: velocity, probability, mutation, and micro steps. Let's go through these quickly. Let's go, say, into my drum track, and let's say that I wanted the hi-hats to have slightly different velocities. You just hold the step that you want to change. You've got the range here. Let's say we make this softer, and this softer, and this softer, this even softer, and then maybe, you know, these guys as well. Just mess around with this a bit. Make it a bit more natural sounding. So that's velocities. Let's quickly go over to probability. You've got control over the chance a step will happen between 1 to 8, so between 13% to 100%. This is around 50%. So I'll take this kick if I didn't want it to happen all the time, but maybe once every 3 or so bars. Didn't happen now, but it might now, and then maybe not next time. Okay, so that's probability. Then there's mutation, which is the chance that a note's pitch will change. Let's maybe go into track 2 and have that control my Rhodes piano. So let's maybe, for the sake of this example, record a very simple line live. Good enough. Okay, so in mutation mode, you can control the probability that a note's pitch will change. So let's say that I want these 2 notes to stay the same, but I want to mess around with the pitch of this guy a lot. This is the probability that the pitch will change, and then maybe want to mess with the pitch of this guy for a bit less. And let's also change this guy every now and then. So let's listen to that. Let's maybe change this as well. So you get the idea. A lot of fun to be had with that. Now, I intentionally showed you this on a melodic line. Probability and mutation also work on chords, but they'll work on each note individually, which can yield odd results. I don't like that very much, but if you do, you can experiment with that. So that's mutation. Let's talk about micro steps, which are both for ratchets as well as for off-the-grid timings. Let's go into my drum track. Now, editing this is a little bit non-intuitive. You first need to pick the step that you want to edit, and then the note that you want to edit. And since my hi-hat is sort of hidden in the 2 rows up here, I'll need to transpose this. Okay, so this is the hi-hat. And then once I've selected the step and the instrument, I could go ahead and add the micro step information, in this case, another little ratchet. So, okay, I could make it more extreme, but again, I gotta pick this and this, then maybe add, why not fill it all up? If I wanted it just to be off time, I could do like this. So that is micro steps. Now, while we were going down this list, let's talk about print to clip. So for that, first, let's maybe add my crazy ratchets back. So let's say that I'm happy with this pattern. I would simply select a cell within a track in Ableton Live and press print to clip. And if I double click this, you'll see everything in my pattern, including the ratchet craziness and everything else. Now, Launchpad Pro MK3 doesn't have an arpeggiator, but you can pretty much fake it with the pattern settings function. So let's go back into, say, my Rhodes track. I'll go into patterns. Remember, you've got 8 patterns per track. Let's just choose a different pattern. So now I'm editing pattern 2 of 8 for track 2. Let's go into steps. Let's program a simple 3-step pattern. Now I've got this, which is not what I wanted. If I go into pattern settings, I could change the length of this pattern to 3 steps and get an arpeggiated pattern. Now, other pattern settings here are the relative speed of a pattern, so I could make it go twice as fast or much faster or slower or in triplets. And you also have pattern order functions, so you can go forward, backwards, forwards and backwards. A little bit hard to see on a 3-step pattern. And randomize, which is also pretty cool. Again, not so useful on a 3-step pattern, but yeah, nice options over here as well in the pattern settings. By the way, you can change not only the clip length or the end point, but also the start point. You could do all this live, of course, which is really nifty. Right, so nothing is playing here. I could choose maybe just a few of these notes or just these 2 or my 3 notes. Anyway, very useful pattern settings. Let's go and zoom out into what scenes are. So this is my first chord pattern, my first drum pattern, and my first Rhodes pattern. All right, I can play that with our random mutation or manually move into my arpeggiated pattern. And with shift, you could also move immediately. So you could play patterns like that. You can also play pattern ranges. So I could start here and end here, which will be odd with the arpeggiated pattern. But it'll jump back and forth. Now, because they're odd lengths, it'll sound odd. So let's just move back into this guy. Anyway, that's how you can chain patterns or choose which patterns you want to play. And then these 16 pads represent scenes. So I could determine that, say, for scene number 1, yeah, all the first patterns would play. Then for scene number 2, I would play maybe this arpeggiated pattern. Then I hit play. And when I wanted to change scenes, we just double tap scene. And if I want to move back here, double tap here. And like I mentioned earlier, you could also play scene ranges and create a song this way, you know, with verse, bridge, chorus, and so on, by pressing a first step, last step, then hitting play, and it will play through the different scenes. And like I mentioned earlier, moving projects is pretty seamless, so you got to remember to save your project, otherwise it's gone when you swap projects. But I could then go ahead into this guy, hit play. That's my first project, and move on to, in this case, a relatively similar project, but it could be something completely different. Just hit play. So project swapping this way is very seamless. I think we covered all the features. Let me just make sure. If you hit shift, you can see what gets activated. Right, so you've got tempo. You can determine the tempo for a project with the up and down keys. And yeah, swing as well, 50% or higher. Let's leave that as is. Almost needless to say, I could sync the 2 up and have whatever's running on this sequencer run in parallel with whatever's going on in the session. For that, I'd need to turn on external sync in Ableton Live, run the sequence. These are the internal sequences running instruments in this case with Ableton Live. Then I could go into the session grid, maybe add these claps here, increase their level perhaps, go back to the session, activate something else. Again, change the level of this track. Yeah, and keep on going. So that is how you can sync the 2 up if you like. So before we summarize the pros and cons, let's quickly take a look at the overall settings, which you reach with a long press on the session button or the setup button here. You can see you've got LED settings and velocity settings, so very similar. Aftertouch, both polyphonic or channel pressure. MIDI controls here let you choose whether the second MIDI out is out or through. Other than that, very similar. Both have a programmable mode for light shows, as you'd expect. Okay, so let's talk about pros and cons. Now, before I compare the two, since the main big news in Launchpad Pro Mark III is its sequencer, How does it fare compared to other sequencers? Pro Mark III is definitely one of the easier to use sequencers I've seen, similar, say, to Novation's Circuit, and indeed, its feature set is basic. It's great for sequencing notes and drums, but if you're looking for parameter and MIDI-CC sequencing or a lot of probability functions for anything other than notes, other sequencers do a better job. Now, I have a full sequencer buyer's guide in my book, but overall I would characterize the sequencer in Pro Mark III as simple and quick and a good starting point or scratch pad for further development, say in Ableton Live or using automation on an external synth. So let's get back to comparing the two. Really, the main thing that Launchpad X has going for it is its price and that it's a little bit smaller, though not by much. So if you're on a tight budget and only interested in a clip launcher and basic note and MIDI controller, then Launchpad X is fine, but you'll get a lot more mileage out of the Launchpad Pro Mark III. True, it costs almost twice as much, so $350 compared to $200, but whether you use Ableton Live or want to use other software or hardware instruments, I think the extra cost is well worth it for the more sensitive pads, the substantially more hands-on control, and the built-in 4-track sequencer and dedicated MIDI outputs, of course. And I say this even if you never plan to use an external instrument, the sequencer and the chord modes are, like I said earlier, great scratch pads and starting points for patterns and melodies that you can easily print into Ableton Live and turn into a full track. If you'd like to also compare these to Novation's Launchpad MIDI Mark III, I'll link to a video about that below, as well as to a fairly comprehensive but basic tutorial that I made about Ableton Live basics. And if you'd like a whole bunch of electronic music ideas, tips, and tricks, including the sequencer buyer's guide I mentioned earlier, check out my ever-expanding book, available to the kind people who support this channel on Patreon. Meanwhile, hit like if this was useful. Feel free to ask me anything in the comments section below. Make sure to ring the bell after you subscribe if you don't want to miss the next one. Thanks for watching.